There is a diner on the corner of 140th and Lenox that no longer exists. It was replaced by a laundromat in 1964, and the laundromat was replaced by nothing in particular by 1978. But in 1952, it had a counter with 9 stools, a back kitchen that smelled like lard and coffee grounds, and a window facing the street that always seemed to catch the light wrong. The glass was slightly warped. Everything outside looked bent. A man sits at the 3rd stool from the door. He has been sitting there for 40 minutes without ordering. The woman behind the counter has not asked him what he wants. She refills the napkin holders. She wipes a section of counter she already wiped. She does not look at him directly, but she has not stopped watching him since he walked in. He is not doing anything remarkable. His hands are flat on the counter. His coat is buttoned to the 2nd button. He has a hat on the stool beside him, placed crown down, which means he intends to stay. His shoes are polished but not new. There is no newspaper in front of him. No cigarette. No reason to be here and no indication he plans to leave. Outside, a boy on a bicycle rides past, slows, looks through the warped glass and pedals away faster than before. The woman behind the counter sees this. She picks up a coffee cup and sets it in front of the man. She fills it without asking. He does not touch it. Something has already happened. You can feel it in the geometry of the room, the way no one else has come in, the way the kitchen has gone quiet even though someone is back there, the way the coffee sits untouched and the woman does not ask why. Harlem in 1952 was not one neighborhood. It was several, stacked on top of each other, sharing the same addresses but operating under completely different rules. There was the Harlem that appeared in newspapers. There was the Harlem that appeared in jazz clubs and poetry readings. There was the Harlem that appeared on Sunday mornings, in church hats and pressed suits and children's shoes that pinched. And then there was the Harlem that did not appear at all. This was the Harlem that ran on handshakes that were never offered casually, on debts that were never written down, on names that changed the temperature in a room the way a draft changes when a door opens somewhere you cannot see. This was the Harlem where certain men did not need to raise their voices because the world around them had already decided to be quiet. The man at the counter was waiting for someone, but not in the way most people wait. He was not anxious. He was not checking the clock. He was occupying space as though space itself owed him the courtesy. And perhaps it did. Because in this version of Harlem, the one that did not appear, courtesy was not a social grace. It was a survival mechanism. There were rules in this Harlem, and the first rule was that you learned the rules without anyone telling you. You learned which blocks belonged to which conversations. You learned which bars closed early and why. You learned which barbers cut hair and which barbers relayed messages. You learned that certain license plates meant certain cars were not to be touched, not to be blocked in, not to be parked behind. You learned which women walked freely at night and what that freedom actually meant. Not that the streets were safe, but that the streets had been made safe for them specifically, and that the reason for that safety had a name. The name was not spoken often, not because people had forgotten it, but because saying it out loud felt like pulling a thread that connected to something enormous and unseen. A name that, once spoken in the wrong tone, in the wrong company, at the wrong volume, could rearrange the next several hours of your life in ways you had not planned for. The name belonged to a man who had been running Harlem's underworld for so long that the word underworld had stopped being accurate. There was no under to it. It was simply the world. It was the way groceries arrived, the way landlords behaved, the way police officers adjusted their routes, the way bail was posted before the arrest was even processed, the way Thanksgiving turkeys appeared on stoops in November, and no one asked where they came from because asking would mean admitting you did not already know, and not knowing was its own kind of danger. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. But nobody called him Ellsworth. Nobody called him Raymond. They called him Bumpy. And the reason the diner was empty, and the reason the woman behind the counter had not asked the man to order, and the reason the boy on the bicycle had pedaled away so quickly, was that the man at the third stool was one of Bumpy's people. And when one of Bumpy's people sat somewhere and waited, the world around that spot went still. Not because anyone had been told to be still, but because stillness was what happened naturally when that current ran through a room. You have to understand what Bumpy Johnson was before you can understand what happened to the men who did not understand it. He was not loud. He read books. He quoted poetry, not to impress anyone, but because he had actually read the poetry and it had stayed with him. He wore suits that fit correctly, not suits that announced themselves. His voice was not deep in the theatrical way of men who want you to feel their authority. It was deep in the way of men who had stopped needing you to feel anything at all. He had come up through the numbers racket, through Dutch Schultz's shadow, then out of it, then past it, then into a space that had no shadow because he was the thing casting it. By the time the 1950s settled over Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was not a gangster in the way movies would later try to frame him. He was an institution. He was infrastructure. He was the reason certain things worked and certain things did not. And if you lived within a 30-block radius of his influence, you already knew this in the same way you knew which direction was north. You did not think about it. You simply oriented yourself accordingly. He had a wife. He had a home. He had a daughter. The daughter is where this story finds its center, and the center is where the silence begins. She was young, not a child, but young in the way that still carried the architecture of a father's protection around her. She moved through Harlem the way a diplomat's child moves through a foreign capital, not unaware of danger, but existing in a space where danger had been preemptively removed. Doors were opened for her. Seats were offered. Eyes followed her not with predatory interest but with the careful awareness of people who understood that what they were looking at was not simply a girl walking down a street but a living perimeter, a boundary, a line that everyone with any sense understood should never be approached, let alone crossed. She did not carry herself with arrogance. By most accounts, she was quiet, polite, and unremarkable in the way that someone raised inside absolute power can afford to be unremarkable. She did not need to perform status. Status had already been performed around her, invisibly, by men she had never met, in rooms she had never entered, through agreements she would never know about. Everyone in Harlem knew whose daughter she was. Everyone. And yet, there were three men who either did not know or knew and did not care. And that distinction between ignorance and arrogance is the hinge on which everything turned. Because in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, ignorance could be corrected. Arrogance could not. The details of what happened have been told in different ways by different people over the decades. Some of those people were there. Most were not. But what everyone agrees on, the way they agree on the direction of gravity, is that these three men encountered Bumpy's daughter at a gathering, a party, or something close to it, a place where music was playing and drinks were being poured and the usual social looseness of evening had set in, a place where boundaries soften, where distances close, where the rules people follow during the day begin to feel like suggestions. The three men were not from Harlem. Or if they were from Harlem, they were from the version of Harlem that did not pay attention, that read the streets like flat text instead of layered code, that saw a young woman and processed only what was visible, her face, her body, her proximity, her apparent aloneness, without reading the invisible architecture surrounding her. They spoke to her. She spoke back or she didn't. The accounts vary. But what the accounts do not vary on is this: At some point during the evening, these three men took Bumpy Johnson's daughter into a bathroom. They took her into a bathroom. And what happened in that bathroom is the event around which this entire story orbits. But it is also the event that I will not describe, because the nature of it is obvious from the reaction it produced, and the reaction it produced is the actual story. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. The fact that three men took a young woman into a bathroom against her will tells you everything. The number 3 tells you something else. The location, a bathroom, a locked door, a space designed for privacy repurposed for something that privacy was never meant to protect, tells you the rest. What those men did in that room is not the mystery. The mystery is what made them believe they could do it. What calculation, or absence of calculation, allowed them to look at this particular girl and see only a girl? Because every other man within a 20-block radius looked at the same girl and saw a wall, a moat, a line drawn not in sand but in something much more permanent. Word traveled. In Harlem, word always traveled, but the speed at which word traveled depended on whose name was attached to it. For most incidents, a fight, a robbery, a debt gone sour, word moved at the speed of gossip. It passed through barber shops and stoops and back rooms over hours or days, gathering exaggeration like a snowball rolling downhill. But when word involved Bumpy Johnson, it did not travel like gossip. It traveled like voltage. It was instant. It was silent. It moved through the neighborhood the way a crack moves through glass, starting from a single point and reaching every edge before the sound even arrives. No one knows exactly how Bumpy found out, whether his daughter told him, whether someone at the gathering recognized her and understood the enormity of what had just occurred, whether one of his people, and his people were everywhere, they were the wallpaper of Harlem, had already been watching and had already sent word before the bathroom door even opened. It does not matter how he found out. What matters is the moment he knew. Because the moment Bumpy Johnson knew is the moment the world changed for three men who did not yet realize their world had changed. Picture a man receiving news, not the way you receive news with a gasp, a widening of the eyes, a hand over the mouth. Not that. Picture a man receiving news the way a lake receives a stone. There is a disturbance. There is a ripple. But the lake does not change shape. The lake does not become something other than a lake. It absorbs. It adjusts. And then the surface goes still again, and the stone is gone, and the depth has not changed at all except that now there is something at the bottom that was not there before. That is how Bumpy Johnson received the news of what was done to his daughter. He did not shout. He did not break anything. He did not make a speech or issue a decree or pick up a telephone and bark orders into it. He went quiet. And the people around him, the people who knew him, who had studied his silences the way sailors study weather, understood immediately that this was the most dangerous kind of quiet. This was not the quiet of thinking. This was not the quiet of restraint. This was the quiet of a decision that had already been made, fully formed, in the space between one breath and the next. There is a difference between a man who is deciding what to do and a man who has already decided. The first man is still accessible. You can talk to him. You can offer alternatives. You can appeal to reason or mercy or even self-interest. The second man is no longer in the room with you. He is already somewhere else in the future, in the place where the thing is done, and his body is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Bumpy Johnson was the second man. The people around him recognized it instantly. The room shifted. Conversations did not trail off, they stopped, mid-syllable, as though someone had cut a wire. Men who had been sitting stood up. Men who had been standing went still. No one asked what had happened. No one needed to. The quality of the silence told them everything they needed to know, which was that they did not need to know anything. They only needed to be ready. And readiness, in Bumpy's world, was not a state of preparation. It was a state of obedience. You did not prepare for what was coming. You simply made yourself available to it. You became a tool, a vehicle, a pair of hands that did not ask questions because questions were a luxury that belonged to a different kind of evening, and this was no longer that kind of evening. Bumpy gave instructions. The accounts of what those instructions were do not come from Bumpy. They come from the margins, from men who overheard fragments, from women who noticed absences, from bartenders who saw certain faces leave and not return. The instructions were not elaborate. They did not need to be. The simplicity of them was the point. When a man like Bumpy Johnson tells you to find someone, he does not need to tell you what to do when you find them. The what to do is implied by the tone of the finding. The three men were found. It did not take long. These were not men who understood the concept of disappearing. They were not men who had contingency plans or alternate addresses or networks of loyalty that could absorb them and render them invisible. They were men who existed in the world plainly, with fixed addresses and regular habits and the ordinary visibility of people who have never had a reason to hide. They had a reason now, but they did not know it yet. When Bumpy's people arrived, and arrived is perhaps too gentle a word because arrival implies a doorbell, a knock, a social protocol. The three men were in the same neighborhood, perhaps even at the same gathering, still laughing, still unaware that the laughter had already been scheduled to stop. What happened next is the core of this story, and it is also the part I will tell you the least about. Not because I do not know, but because the telling is not the point. The point is the not telling. The point is the space left empty. Because in the world where this happened, the details were never discussed. Not out of discretion, and not out of shame, but because the details were designed to make discussion unnecessary. The response was constructed to be so complete, so total, so final, that no one would ever need to ask what it was. They would simply know, and knowing would be enough. What I will tell you is this: Bumpy Johnson handled this himself. He did not delegate. He did not send intermediaries. He did not allow the machinery of his organization to process this event through the usual channels. This was not a business matter. This was not a territorial dispute. This was not a message to be sent through a chain of command. This was his daughter, and the response to what was done to his daughter was not an organizational function. It was a personal one. He was there. The three men saw his face. They saw it before anything else happened. And in that moment, the moment of recognition, the moment when the face registered and the name attached itself to the face, and the implications attached themselves to the name, everything those three men believed about the world they lived in collapsed. Every assumption, every casual cruelty, every moment of entitlement that had carried them into that bathroom with that girl, it all collapsed at once, and what replaced it was the understanding that they had made an error so profound that the word error was insufficient. They had stepped outside the boundaries of a world that had very specific rules about what happened to people who stepped outside its boundaries. And the rules were not flexible. What Bumpy Johnson did to those three men in response to what they did to his daughter has no single authoritative account. There is no police report. There is no trial transcript. There is no newspaper article from the Amsterdam News or the New York Age describing events and attributing sources. There is only the silence afterward, the shape of the silence, the weight of it, and the silence told everyone everything. In the days that followed, something changed in Harlem. It was not visible. You could not photograph it. You could not point to a building or a street corner and say, "Here, this is where it changed." It was atmospheric. It was a shift in the way people carried themselves, the way conversations were navigated, the way certain subjects were approached, or, more accurately, not approached. The three men were no longer present in the neighborhood. Their absence was not discussed. People did not ask where they had gone. People did not speculate over coffee about what might have happened. The absence was accepted the way you accept the absence of rain on a clear day, as a condition, not an event, as something that simply was, without requiring explanation or context. But the absence radiated. It radiated outward from the event like heat from a stone that has been sitting in the sun. You could feel it even if you had not been told what caused it. You could feel it in the way men spoke to women they did not know, more carefully, more distantly, with a formality that had not been there a week earlier. You could feel it in the way certain bars enforced closing times that had previously been theoretical. You could feel it in the way mothers held their daughters' hands a little tighter when they walked past certain storefronts, not because those storefronts were dangerous, but because the memory of what had happened to someone's daughter was still fresh and still radiating and still warm. Bumpy Johnson did not announce what he had done. He did not call a meeting. He did not summon the various players and operators and hangers-on who populated his world and deliver a speech about consequences. He simply returned to his life. He sat in his usual places. He ate at his usual restaurants. He walked his usual streets with his usual measured pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his hat set at its usual angle, his face carrying its usual expression of contained awareness. And the world around him adjusted. That is the part that most people miss when they tell this story. They focus on the act. They focus on the violence, implied or explicit. They focus on the what happened. But the real story is not what happened. The real story is what happened afterward. The real story is the adjustment, because the adjustment was total. Within a week, there was not a man, woman, or child in Harlem who did not understand, without being told, without being instructed, without reading a flyer or hearing an announcement, that Bumpy Johnson's daughter was untouchable, that the word untouchable was not strong enough, that what had happened to the three men was not a punishment but a reclassification of reality, that the world now contained a new rule, and the rule was absolute, and the rule would not be explained or justified or debated. It would simply be enforced, permanently, without exception, without appeal. But here is what made it more than just a gangster's revenge. Here is what elevated it from brutality to something closer to governance. The protection did not stop at Bumpy's daughter. In the weeks and months that followed, something shifted in the way young women in Harlem were treated, not just the daughters of powerful men, but all young women. The unspoken message had metastasized beyond its original target. It had become a general principle, absorbed into the culture of the neighborhood like dye into fabric. The specific had become the universal. What began as one father's response to one crime against one girl became, through the alchemy of fear and respect, and the silence that carries both, a broader understanding about what was and was not acceptable. Men who had previously moved through the neighborhood with the careless entitlement of those who believed consequences were for other people suddenly discovered that consequences were, in fact, for them. That the buffer zone they had assumed existed between their actions and the repercussions of those actions had evaporated overnight. That the world had contracted around them, and the contraction was permanent. Bar owners enforced standards they had never previously bothered with. Men who lingered too long around young women they had no business being near were asked to leave, and the asking was not casual. It carried weight. It carried the memory of three men who had not been asked to leave and who had therefore been removed in a different way, a more permanent way. This is how power actually works, not through spectacle, not through demonstration. through the residue, through the afterimage, through the way a single event processed through the nervous system of an entire community becomes a permanent alteration of behavior, a new normal that requires no maintenance, no reminders, no reinforcement, because the original event was so complete that its echo never fully fades. Bumpy Johnson understood this instinctively. He understood that a man who has to keep proving his power does not actually have power. Power is the ability to do a thing once and have it last forever. Power is the ability to change the rules of a world without issuing a memorandum. Power is the silence after the event, the long, permanent, self-sustaining silence that does the work of 1,000 threats without requiring a single word. The police, of course, existed. They existed in Harlem the way weather exists, as a condition, sometimes inconvenient, occasionally dangerous, but fundamentally navigable by people who understood the patterns. The police in 1952 Harlem were not an alien force. They were participants in the same ecosystem, operating under the same informal rules, responding to the same invisible pressures. They knew about Bumpy Johnson in the way that fish know about the current. They moved within his influence without necessarily acknowledging it. When the three men disappeared from the neighborhood, no investigation was opened. No missing persons report generated official concern. This was not because the police were corrupt, though some of them were. It was because the police, like everyone else, could read the silence. They understood that the silence surrounding this particular event was not an invitation to inquiry. It was a wall, and walls in Harlem were not things you walked through. They were things you walked around, quietly, without comment, without looking up to see how high they went. There were detectives who knew. They knew in the way that detectives always know things they cannot prove and would not want to prove even if they could, because proving would mean entering a conversation that no one wanted to have. Proving would mean disturbing a silence that was, in its own terrible way, functional. The silence kept order. The silence maintained a certain equilibrium. The silence did the work that the police department itself was not equipped or willing to do in Harlem in 1952. And so the silence was allowed to stand. Years passed. Bumpy Johnson continued to operate. He continued to walk the streets of Harlem with his measured pace. His hat, his suits, his books of poetry, his peculiar combination of violence and refinement that made him impossible to categorize, and therefore impossible to dismiss. He was not a thug. He was not a philosopher. He was not a protector or a predator. He was all of these things simultaneously, held together by a will that did not require external validation and a code that did not require external explanation. His daughter grew up. She lived her life. The details of her life after this event are not mine to tell, and I would not tell them even if they were, because the point of this story is not her recovery or her trauma or her eventual peace. The point of this story is the three men, and the fact that their names have been erased so completely that even the people who knew them have forgotten, or claim to have forgotten, which in Harlem amounts to the same thing. Think about that for a moment. Three men who existed, who had names, addresses, families, habits, favorite foods, preferred seats at preferred bars, erased so completely that even memory declined to preserve them. Not because memory is weak, but because memory, in a community governed by the kind of power Bumpy Johnson wielded, is selective in the same way that everything else is selective. Memory chooses what to keep based on what is safe to keep. And the memory of those three men was not safe, so it was discarded, like a coat that no longer fit, like a key to a door that no longer existed. What remained was the lesson, and the lesson was not articulated. It was not written on walls or printed in pamphlets. It was simply absorbed, the way children absorb language, not through instruction but through immersion, through breathing the air of a neighborhood that had been permanently altered by a single act of consequence. Young men growing up in Harlem in the years after this event did not know the details. They did not know the names of the three men. They did not know the specific date or the specific gathering or the specific bathroom, but they knew the shape of the story. They knew its outline the way you know the outline of a mountain on the horizon, not because anyone pointed it out, but because it was always there, defining the landscape, casting its shadow, establishing the limit of how far you could go before the ground dropped away. And they adjusted their behavior accordingly. Not all of them, not perfectly. The world is not a machine that produces uniform outcomes. There were men who tested boundaries after this event, as there are always men who test boundaries. But the boundaries themselves had moved. The threshold for what was tolerable had shifted downward. The margin for error had narrowed. And the consequence for crossing the line had been established at a level so severe that even partial knowledge of it, even rumor, even whisper, even the vague atmospheric awareness that something had happened to someone who had done something to someone who belonged to someone, was sufficient to produce caution. That is the legacy of Bumpy Johnson in this particular story. Not the violence, not the revenge, not the specific acts that were committed against the three men in response to what the three men committed against his daughter. The legacy is the caution, the permanent, self-sustaining, endlessly reproducing caution that infected an entire neighborhood and altered its behavior for a generation. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. He was at a restaurant. He was eating. He suffered a heart attack. He was 62 years old. He died the way he had lived in public in Harlem, surrounded by the neighborhood he had shaped through a combination of generosity and menace that no one before or since has quite replicated. At his funeral, the streets were full, not because people had been told to come, but because not coming would have meant something, and in Bumpy's Harlem, meanings were dangerous. Years later, people would tell stories about him. Books would be written, movies would be made. Actors would put on his suits and try to walk the way he walked and speak the way he spoke and carry the silence the way he carried it. Some of them came close. None of them arrived. Because the thing about Bumpy Johnson that no actor can replicate and no screenplay can capture is the weight. The gravitational pull of a man who has done things that everyone knows about and no one discusses. The way a room reorganizes itself around that kind of presence. The way laughter becomes quieter, not because anyone has been told to be quiet, but because volume itself feels inappropriate in the proximity of that much unspoken history. The three men. People still do not say their names. Not because the names carry danger, the danger died with Bumpy, or at least changed shape after his death. They do not say the names because the names have become irrelevant. The men have been reduced to a function. They are not characters in a story. They are the negative space. They are the hole in the picture that tells you what the picture is about. They are the reason a girl could walk home alone at midnight through 12 blocks of Harlem and arrive at her door without a single man on any corner saying a word. Not because the men on the corners were kind, but because the men on the corners remembered. Old women in Harlem, when asked about Bumpy Johnson, will sometimes smile. Not warmly, not coldly. Somewhere in between, in that territory where admiration and fear share a border so thin that the distinction becomes meaningless. They will say he was a gentleman. They will say he was terrifying. They will say both things in the same sentence without feeling any contradiction, because in the Harlem they grew up in, those two qualities were not opposites. They were prerequisites. And if you ask them about his daughter, if you are foolish enough or brave enough or simply ignorant enough to bring it up, the smile will disappear. Not into anger, not into sadness, into something older than both, into a silence that is itself a complete sentence, a silence that says, "You already know, and if you don't know, you should, and if you should and you still don't, then perhaps you are the kind of person who needs to learn the way those three men learned. The hard way." There is a building on 143rd Street that used to be a social club. It is a church now. The congregation is small. The pastor is elderly. The pews are wooden and original to the building. If you sit in the back pew and look toward the front, you can see a door to the left of the pulpit. The door leads to a hallway. The hallway leads to a bathroom. The bathroom has been renovated twice since 1952. New tiles, new fixtures, new paint, but the dimensions are the same. The size of the room has not changed, and if you stand inside it, you can feel how small it is, how close the walls are, how a single person would fill it, how three people would crowd it, how a fourth person, a young woman, someone's daughter, would have no room to move, no room to escape, no space at all between herself and what was about to happen. The pastor does not know this history, or perhaps he does and has decided, like everyone else, that knowing and not speaking is its own form of prayer. Harlem has changed, the buildings have changed, the people have changed, the money flows differently now, the power sits in different hands. The names on the doors are different names connected to different networks, answerable to different authorities. The old codes have faded. The old rules have softened. The old silences have been filled with new noise, construction, commerce, complaint, and the general chatter of a neighborhood that no longer operates under the governance of a single man's reputation. But if you walk those blocks at night, the blocks between 135th and 150th, between Lenox and 8th, and if you pay attention, not to what is being said but to what is not being said, you can still feel the faintest trace of the old architecture, the invisible infrastructure that Bumpy Johnson built, not with money or guns or political connections, but with consequence, with the simple, brutal, elegant principle that certain things, once done, could not be undone, and that certain responses, once delivered, did not need to be repeated. That trace is in the concrete. It is in the way the streetlights fall. It is in the memory of the neighborhood itself, stored not in books or records but in the behavior of people who learned, through proximity, through inheritance, through the ambient education of living in a place that had been shaped by a specific gravity, that there are lines you do not cross. Not because someone will stop you, but because of what happens on the other side. The diner on 140th and Lenox has been gone for decades. The stool where the man sat has been gone just as long. The warped glass window was removed and replaced and removed again. The woman behind the counter whose name no one remembers is dead. The boy on the bicycle is an old man now, if he is alive at all. But the coffee cup, the one she placed in front of the man without being asked, the one he never touched, the one that sat on the counter growing cold, while the man waited for something that the rest of the world was not supposed to know about. That coffee cup, in some metaphorical sense, is still sitting there.